illustrates that very well. That this is not just about, this book is not just a book written by a diplomat who recounts his experiences and so on, but is actually a scholarly work and a significant contribution to the Indian African scholarship. Ambassador Bhatia has been a critical actor in how India's relations with Africa have evolved through his various postings. And of course, when the India-Africa relation was ramped up to summit with the first India-Africa summit in 2008, he was in South Africa at the time. I think we think about, as we do also with the China relationship, as if when the summit started was really when the relations took off. But India, of course, India and Africa have long-standing links, very historical links, both politically, in terms of solidarity in the anti-colonial struggle, and in terms of South-South cooperation. And this also particularly, of course, in the very bilateral relationship between South Africa and India. Of course, India's relations with Africa, and I think the book speaks to that very well, are increasingly played out in a continent where external partners have multiplied. And certainly the volume and the scope and the manner in which external partners are engaging on the continent has multiplied. Africa is seen as an important market, it's seen as an important political actor in global governance, it's seen as a development partner in terms of South-South cooperation. And clearly this creates, certainly at the rhetorical level, but also sometimes on the ground, a sense of competition, who's going to get more. This is clearly something that, sitting here on the continent is not the way we see external partnerships. We see them certainly as being complementary, and we prefer them to be complementary rather than competitive. And if we just think about the current geopolitical environment in which we live, where there is probably too much competition, Africa really wants to emphasize the importance of actually cooperation and working together to achieve developmental objectives rather than processes that are actually inimical to that. This book is launching today, India-Africa Relations, Changing Horizons, and it is about changing horizons, covers every aspect of the relationship, and brings in critically, of course, the Africa-China dimension. You can't talk about many of these without reflecting on China as well, and what that means for Africa-India. I would say that, when we talk about China in Africa, there was this, we see this as this big actor with, significant financial resources and infrastructure projects on the continent, and India plays its role and its partnership in a different way. And I would say it's been, over the many decades, it's been very steady and firm, and sometimes without much fanfare and publicity. And sometimes, of course, as I think is also noted in the book and in the reviews, sometimes it is compared with China. And I think on a number of levels, that comparison is often favorable. There are obviously other instances where, again, as you pointed out, it's not always compared in the same light. I'm going to post, when we start the conversation, I'm actually going to post the link to the Routledge book for you to have the opportunity to peruse the early pages and certainly to consider buying it. I'll also post a few of the reviews of the book that have been undertaken in recent times. But let me then also just move, before I hand over to Ambassador Bhatia, let me also introduce properly my two discussants this afternoon. The first joining us from India, Rajan, I don't know, are you in Delhi? Are you elsewhere in India?
I'm in Delhi.
In Delhi, okay.
Yes.
Dr. Rajan Harshe, he's an eminent social scientist, a distinguished scholar in international relations studies and an educationist. He was the first vice chancellor of Central University of Allahabad. He was also president of the G.P. Bant Institute of Social Sciences. He has headed he's been president of the African Studies Association of India, sectional president of the Indian History Congress for the year 2009-2010, president of the Indian Congress of Asian and Pacific Studies, and it goes on. I'd like to also commend to you one of his recent books published a couple of years ago, which is talks about Africa in world affairs, politics of imperialism, the Cold War, and globalization. And I was just telling him that I've now downloaded it onto my Kindle. So Dr. Harshe, it's really great to have you join us from Delhi this afternoon. And then let me move to my colleague from just south in Cape Town, Dr. Mandira Bhagwandeen, whose experience is not specifically focused on India, Africa, but is a young up-and-coming scholar at the University of Cape Town, a senior lecturer there. She's worked with think tanks, local and international corporate companies. She's a senior researcher at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, specifically, where she is focusing on Africa's regional integration and industrialization, all very key elements of what Africa looks for in partnerships with external actors. Her primary focus in a lot of her academic work has been Africa-China relations, but she has a wider interest in Africa-Asia relations and the political economy of energy and natural resources. She also, apart from working at the Nelson Mandela School, is also does some lecturing at the UCT Political Studies Department. She's also affiliated to a number of international think tanks. I think this is the first time, Mandira, we've got you on a SIRE panel, so it's really great.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
And so really wonderful that both of you could accept our invitations to be discussants on the book. So enough from me now. I'm going to now hand over to Ambassador Bhatia to give us a bit of an overview of his book.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a real pleasure and privilege for me to be here among friends. Let me first greet the panelists, Dr. Rajan and Dr. Mandira. I think it's very gracious of them to have found time to participate in this event, and I would be as keen as all of us to listen to their views on the theme of this evening. To you, Elizabeth, thank you so much for a warm personal introduction. We left South Africa some 11 years back. But the old proverb is absolutely true. You can leave Africa, but Africa does not leave you. And this is so because, first of all, it was not an accidental brief acquaintance with the continent in my case. I had the chance to spend 4 long and very productive years in Eastern Africa, serving as India's High Commissioner in Kenya. And this was at the turn of the century and a part of the first decade of the 21st century. And then as the decade progressed, I was back in South Africa, which is arguably the most important diplomatic assignment in Africa for Indian diplomats. And this was, a very large and very talented team of officers that I had the chance to head while operating from Pretoria. We had some wonderful colleagues who headed our offices in Durban, Johannesburg, and Cape Town, and they all rose to become stars in the Indian diplomatic service. And so I'm very happy that this Africa connection has lasted not just through me, but through many of my colleagues who served in Africa. As I said, I'm a little biased in favor of SIA, which is seen as the front-ranking think tank on the continent. I have benefited from your intellectual products and contributions, and some of them have been cited in this book. But more importantly, I think I would also like to put in a word for South Africa as such and its pivotal role in African affairs. I think we all saw it with our own eyes, how the rise of new South Africa in the 90s in turn created a rejuvenation and renaissance of Africa. So let me be honest right in the beginning, even before I talk about the book. Among these various schools of people who look at Africa and who keep talking about Afro-optimism and Afro-pessimism and Afro-skepticism, I want to say that I stand at what can best be described as Afro-realism and optimism. We are all here because we work on the assumption that Africa has demographically, politically, economically, and strategically has a bigger role to play in world affairs, and it is based on that conception that we are trying to connect Africa, or to help Africa connect to the world and help the world to connect Africa better. This book with two covers, if I may be allowed to show it on the camera. This is the one which you have shown on your, this is the global edition. This was released in November. And the second one is the South Asia edition, which has a little bit of more color because it features an African mask and an Indian lotus and the blue tinge which represents the Indian Ocean. So we are, India and Africa, neighbors across the Indian Ocean. We are far nearer than we often seem to think, and I think we will try through the course of this evening to convey this basic point that it is not just India that needs Africa, or it is not just that Africa needs India. I think this larger relationship, Asia-Africa relationship, which grew at a particular time, also needs renewal, also needs rejuvenation and reinforcement. Now, in terms of an event like this, it's very important for the author to talk about the book, but just enough. Not too much, because if you talk too much, nobody will probably read the book. And if you don't talk enough, then probably they will in any case not come anywhere near the book. So balance I need to do, and the only way I know how to do this is to talk about the outline of the book and perhaps some of the conclusions, and thereafter then the experts can take over. First of all, I felt that India-Africa relations is a topic that must be seen not in isolation, but in the context of, number one, what is happening in Africa, and number two, how the rest of the world is connecting with Africa. I think if we don't bring those two factors in, frankly, India-Africa relationship in isolation becomes a somewhat of a limited subject. So effectively, I start off in my first chapter by talking about the transitions in Africa. This is a subject on which many foreign scholars, experts and observers and institutions have held forth. But I think it's also very important in my view to hear the African voices. So I've tried to bring in what Africans themselves feel and say and write about the changes in Africa. Now, of course, changes and transitions in Africa is a very long saga, and I think it is often not appreciated as to where the timeline began. Was it in 1957 when the liberation started? or when 1963 OAU was set up, or eventually when the age of lost hopes was over and the 90s finished, and then the rejuvenation and renaissance of Africa began, or maybe actually now in the 21st century. But the point that is being made is that there are constant changes happening in Africa which do not get sufficiently and adequately reported and commented in world media. And as a result, an average person's view of Africa remains so dated and therefore so inadequate that it is the responsibility of everyone who is interested in Africa, especially scholars on Africa, to talk about those changes and transitions. My second aspect is to bring in the concept of the third scramble for Africa. And this has been done in a positive manner. As we know, the first and second scramble were either for Africa's land or Africa's allegiance during the Cold War. This third one is the scramble for partnership with Africa. And this really has affected this scramble because many parties have been part of it, ranging from Brazil and in a way to some extent Mexico in Latin America, to countries as far as Australia, Indonesia, UAE, Turkey and the rest of them. Of course, the old colonial powers in Europe, they reinvented themselves and their partnership, and then there is the US. So all this has been packed in a chapter so that we are clear as to how, not in 50 years back, not 70 years back, but in the last 20 to 30 years back, how the world has connected with Africa. You noticed that I did not mention a very important country, China. And the reason is that there is a separate exclusive chapter devoted to China-Africa tango. Now, this is the most controversial theme in Africa studies today. Elizabeth pointed out this, and we often have had long discussions with her and many other scholars on this subject. I mean, this alone is a subject for a whole conference, and I'm sure many conferences have taken place on this. People have won PhDs galore on this subject. So it was a challenge how to write on Africa-China tango in the discipline of a chapter of 5,000 or 6,000 words. What I have tried to do is to be as impartial as possible for an Indian scholar and a former Indian diplomat, because when it comes to China, quite honestly, it is not easy for us to do so. But I have reckoned the fact that the most important party on the China debate is Africa itself. And once again, therefore, I have tried to bring in African voices and African points of view to understand as to what they mainly are saying about the partnership with China. And that way, having heard the Western view and Chinese or pro-Chinese view, it's important to draw lessons from what Africans are saying and the future direction of this relationship. Now, with this kind of introduction set, I go into the India-Africa relationship, and here there was a big challenge. In fact, I have been asked by people within India itself as to how you can write a book with a of relationship with the continent with 54 countries. Have you written about all of them? What has been your approach? Now, it was a studied approach. I have looked at three main aspects: the continental dimensions, then the regional aspects, and finally the bilateral aspects. And to answer this skeptic's question, 54 countries, no, I have not written about all 54 countries. I somewhat subjectively chose or made a list of 15 countries which are considered consequential in various regions of Africa, and I have presented short snapshots of India's relationships with each of those 15 countries. And yes, countries like South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, Senegal, Rwanda, and all of them figure in it. On the regional dimension, just a quick word. I think barring the business community here, the knowledge about what is happening at the regional level is still inadequate. It needs to be expanded, and it has to be seen in the context of the continental trends, of 2063 vision and all the new institutions which were created partly because of the initiative by South African leaders. So all that has been packed in. I cannot say they have been all discussed exhaustively, but there are lots of clues in the book for those who want to go into detail and understand and study this further. Finally, in my last 2 or 3 minutes, Elizabeth, let me make a few broad points about the India-Africa relationship. I think generally speaking, in India, there is considerable satisfaction with this partnership, especially the way it has developed in the last decade and a half. But I also believe that contentment or over-contentment is inimical to further progress, and therefore I think it is important for a scholar to point to the shortcomings and also offer some constructive suggestions, because only then the policy makers would benefit from the policy analysis that you and I and others actually do. And here fundamentally my conclusion is threefold. I feel that in the past decade, at the government to government level, India-Africa relationship has made considerable progress. I'm talking until the COVID period. India did what it could to help Africa, which was probably not seen as enough in many parts of Africa. But until the COVID era began, the interaction was very intense at the government level. At the business to business level, I think we need to do more work, because if we are satisfied with the present levels of economic interaction, 55 billion of trade annually, and total investment stock of about $70 billion, then frankly this is not enough, and there has to be a whole series of strong measures that need to be taken to take this onto a higher level. And finally, this is where I feel very strongly and passionately, at the third space level, at the level of civil society, think tanks, youth, women, universities, the rest of it, we have to work harder, and that is where I think a humble effort such as this book and this very interesting connection of think tanks and thought leaders of our two countries and other countries could make a difference. So this is all that I wish to say, and I really thank you very much for hosting this and for this opportunity. Elizabeth, over to you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And there are a couple of points that I'd like to come back to you on, but after our two panelists have spoken. So let me move on then to Dr. Rajan Harsher.
Thank you very much. To start with, I would like to thank Saya and Elizabeth for having me over to discuss one of my best friend's book. I must also say that, Ambassador Bhatia and I have been together for 50 years almost. We met in Delhi when I was student in JLU and he was IFS professional. He went to Paris in our embassy and I was student in Sciences Po in Paris, so that's where we met again. And it has been going on wonderfully. So I know him personally also, not just as a scholar diplomat. And I feel that, he's very cultured, balanced, even-handed always, never eccentric, never takes positions which can't be defensible. And that is his basic strength as a writer. He's also extremely clear. And that's why this book, as you can see, is very accessible, very lucidly written, and extremely thought-provoking and comprehensive. So let me at the outset congratulate Ambassador Bhatia for writing such a wonderful book. Now, whatever struck me while reading it, I'll just put it across in few points consistently. One is what he does with the reader is he makes the reader play at his book. Somewhere he's placing Africa in world affairs. He's showing trends in Africa, like African regional organization, African unity movement like AU, or before that Organization of African Unity, transitions in Africa. So he's placing Africa in world affairs, current status of Africa. And then in that broad shadow or broad umbrella of Africa in world affairs, he's looking at major trends in India, major trends in Africa and India. So somewhere it's not a conventional book like in a bilateral relationship, India and Kenya, India and South Africa. It's a book with a very broad imaginative sweep, and he has done it very successfully and beautifully. So that's a very important strength of the book, I would say. I would just come down to certain things which he's saying which are interesting. When he talks about transition, some certain figures, 93% of the people are mobile in Africa. 5 portals are available, sewerage is also available in 30% parts. But what struck me in that entire debate was the growing young population. India's population is growing, but Africa is growing much, much more. And that young population in India as well as Africa can become a bridge to understand each other, do things for each other, and that he has constantly hinted but not talked so explicitly. Being a kind of professor, I think of it as a very major opportunity. We have to think innovatively about this. He's also interestingly talked about African economies. Some of them, he says, they are fast-growing economies, indeed true. And 16 economies have more than 5% GDP rate, and that's quite substantial. It's another point that he makes is that Africa is getting integrated into the world economy, but it is not fully integrated still. So world economy is something, Africa is at the threshold still, but not fully in. There are, of course, mega cities like Cairo, Johannesburg, Kinshasa, Luanda. But point is, it's not integrated. And another thing is, only 38% of Africa is under democracies. So somewhere a large part of Africa is under authoritarian regimes. And we have authoritarian regimes, then there is no constitutional checks and balances. But still, 38% are democratic regimes, but democracies, according to the author, are fragile, on fragile foundations. They can be rigged, they can be many things, but yes, trend towards democracy is visible since the 90s and it has gone on. I would also like to say, he's kind of alluded to African peer review mechanism, which is important, it could come for discussion later, and also NEPAD, New Economic Partnership for Development. I think when he sees the transition, he swings back to 20th century, and I'll just give 2 points here. One is two statesmanly leaders in India who kind of impacted Africa, Gandhi and Nehru. Now, whatever Gandhi did is very well known, well documented in South Africa. I myself saw that Museum of Gandhi in Johannesburg. But Bhatia is, very candid as a scholar. There's a kind of impeccable honesty. He's talked about, how Gandhi's statues are being brought down in Malawi and Ghana. And because there's a general sentiment that he is fighting primarily for Indian community and not for Africans. So somewhere the point is he was man of his times at one level, like Marx was man of his times. That's why he called Asians as some backward people and also Asiatic mode of production he wrote about. So there can be possibility that a towering person also can be at one level functioning like man of his times because those were his limitations. And he's put it very nicely. On the contrary, Nehru had a chance to do something. An entire decolonization movement, whether it's Bandung project or later, was accelerated in Nehru's time. And he has given beautiful example of Rasgotra, who kind of precipitated in the United Nations how the decolonization movement went through. And this is a lasting contribution. Another point that he's made is Nehru's relationship with Kwame Nkrumah, personal relationship. He has also talked about George Padmore, the Pan-Africanist, and in the relationship with Nehru from 1938. I would add also Abu Bakr Tafawa Balewa Nehru, the correspondence in interwar period. So Nehru was in touch with this, and when he was internationalizing India's freedom struggle, he was also involved in how Africa can be liberated, and this point is very major. Then he jumps into world affairs, and that chapter is absolutely charming chapter. I enjoyed it because I enjoy international politics. So he relates Africa to European Union, and I recall, from my student days, I have been reading it, like Brussels Conventions, Yaoundé Conventions, Lomé Conventions, how European Union and African associates got involved with each other, and how unequal relationship in terms of trade, technology, equipment, finance, it was stuck steadily, and how perhaps it paved the way for neo-colonial world. That is discussed there. Then, of course, United States and its non-territorial dominance across the world and in Africa. And it's a widespread interest in primary products in strategic areas like Horn of Africa, South Africa. That's also discussed. Then you have, of course, other countries like Japan, South Korea, primarily interested in business and trade. United Arab Emirates, again another feat, because how connection between Horn of Africa, Red Sea, Bab el Mandeb, and that part of politics, and how UAE is playing the role. Then you have Australia participating in perhaps peacekeeping operations in Africa. You have Brazil, long-lasting relationship because Portugal controlled Brazil, and how Brazil plays its own role. And of course, Indonesia, Turkey, which is a new actor, and how powerful it is. I thought this gives a very important reflection of world politics of our time. And Ambassador has done it absolutely competently, absolutely lucidly, and I enjoyed the chapter. Then he had reserved something like a good boxer reserves a shot to hit, and that's how he jumped on China. And then that's also again what I would say, full of ideas, full of how China and Africa rewarded, gave chance to unheard voices to state what they want. I thought here in this particular area, if he had because he had made at one point on page 58 a statement that Mao Zedong's policy was ideological. I think Mao's successors also have the ideology. Every foreign policy has ideology. So somewhere what perhaps I would like to say is, if he had defined the word ideology, now what does it mean? Is it a system of belief which has self-justifying and self-promoting worldview? A system of belief with self-fulfilling and self-justifying worldview. Every country has some ideology or vision of policy, and liberal democracies also have the ideology, but they don't mention it so explicitly as much as communists and the fascists do. That's what I think. We can debate on this, of course, but it's a point of academic interest. He has also talked about list of countries, whether loans, grants, and I was struck by the investment in Angola. I think he would give the explanation for it, how $19.2 billion was invested there, and also Uganda and Kenya. So how certain countries become favorites, certain countries are overlooked. What is the China's outlook of selecting something and rejecting something? We would hear from him, but that is also a very interesting chapter. Then we come down to India and Africa, where I would like to say wide range of issues are discussed. He has left nothing: economy, trade, geostrategy, health and medical care, education, cooperation against terror. There is nothing left. It's so wonderfully comprehensive. I would say he has also discussed India-Africa Forum summits properly. And even minute details like India building in Ethiopia, Djibouti railway line, that also gets covered. Some of the things which he has said, and also they're common, but they fit it here properly. Whatever Africa consumes, it doesn't produce, and whatever it produces, it doesn't consume. And that's a very major argument, actually, and he's played with it. What struck me was that he's also highlighted the fact that Indian embassies, or the number is growing from 29 to 47, and that much is India interested in Africa, which is a very major point to be made. He has also related India to regional communities and certain lively areas which are very major part of modern international politics research, like Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific region, he has not lost sight of. I think whenever we studied India, we studied at the same time, Ambassador and myself, and they used to give Panikar's famous quotation, India is a castle surrounded by the seas and capped by the Himalayas. And this castle surrounded by the seas now is realizing its maritime potentials for maritime security. And the book comes out with that properly. I think he talks about Indian Ocean Rim Association, maritime security, Africa's integrated maritime policy, and India's urge to firm up ties with islands and also the important maritime states like Mauritius, Seychelles, and Mozambique. I think that's a kind of very well-driven point that India is not merely Indo-Pacific power, but from Pacific to Southwest Africa, it is looking at this policy in a very integrated manner. And that ambassador has brought out without any doubt and very convincingly. He has talked about blue economy, which again means trade and many more things, Sagar like security and growth for all countries. I felt, it's a kind of such a beautiful bird's eye view that, I got absorbed in reading it. For ambassadors, he has done one more interesting thing. He has selected 15 African countries and given handbook-like data about how relevant they are from India's standpoint and from Africa's standpoint, and major developments in relationship between those 15 countries like Angola, Ghana, Kenya, etc. India's role in peacekeeping operations, India's role in non-security, traditional security and non-traditional security, India's role in preventing piracy. I think one after another has gone on and also touched COVID crisis also. So many things are available in this book, including, Africans in India and Indians in Africa. Somewhere perhaps, he has made a very interesting tongue-in-cheek observation that, how well we have to treat the African students who come to India, because are they victims of racism? Are we treating them in our universities properly? That is the point. Like if Indians feel unhappy when they're ill-treated in Australia because there is racism, then Indians should take up responsibility of treating African students and visitors well and not be racist. And that's a very sensitively made point. I would only like to make some points, not as a matter of criticism, but suggestions, friendly kind of thinking, that because he's so balanced and he's so lovely as a human being, he has taken very balanced view. And I thought as a senior ambassador, even if he had taken a rather critical view of India's policy in terms of implementation of projects or in terms of allocated funds, why are they not getting properly utilized? It wouldn't have been bad. It would have given bite to the kind of book. Another thing I felt was, he has shown figures of trade which are falling. Like, you see falling trade figures after 2015, particularly between Africa and the rest of the world. My kind of plausible explanation is because primary commodities and the prices were falling, the figures are falling, volume of trade hasn't reduced. Only prices have come down of the primary commodities, and Africa is at the receiving end. I would also say that because of his balanced part, sometimes he kind of blunts a sharp argument, even if he could have made it, because he is senior enough to make it. But that is the inhibition and that is a personality. He would never be unkind to anybody because he understands difficulties. Like suppose you say there is some inefficiency in working out of the aid, cumbersome bureaucracy. I think it is on either side, African as well as Indian side, have cumbersome bureaucracy. But he has restrained himself, and that's a typical kind of ambassador speaking, and not a scholar sometimes. Scholars sometimes are eccentric. I would also like to say last point, and that is book is so comprehensive and it can lead to several other books, and that's the strength of this book. Now, so many books can come out of the way stakeholders are in Africa. For example, public and private sector investments of India. So public and private sector companies and some of the work can be done on this area. Similarly, military and what kind of role military cooperation and military has and how military of India is stakeholder also is important. Similarly, healthcare, like India is already pharmacy of the world, healthcare, telemedicine we are offering, and education. Like African students require proper education, and India also is capable of providing. It has institutions. We need to improve them. That's a different matter. That's a kind of work in progress. But so many other works can come out of this because it has provided with you a very large backdrop. And that's a platform on which so much more can happen. So this particular work, which is kind of, I would consider landmark work, because not many studies are of this kind that I have read in recent times, For this landmark work, I would like to congratulate my friend absolutely heartily for doing so. And I'm sure more is in the waiting, because he's kind of scholar in residence, also dedicated scholar apart from being a diplomat. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, Elizabeth. And I'm very proud of Ambassador, and I'm very happy that I spoke today. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Harshe. Absolutely. I think you've really picked up a number of very important points that are covered in the book, and I want to come back to some of them in the Q&A. Mandira, over to you.
Hi there, Elizabeth. First of all, thank you to you and your team for inviting me to participate in an official SCI event. As a student, I've attended many, and so it's almost coming full circle, being allowed to kind of be an official participant. I'd like to first also welcome everyone joining us around the world this afternoon in South Africa. And namaste to all our Indian audience joining us from India. I must say, I first have to thank my fellow discussant for Dr. Harshe for providing a very detailed and critical overview of the book. I take a shorter kind of route, and I've just pointed out 5 points that have stood out for me. And I have 3 questions that I would like the ambassador to address, and the wider audience, and possibly the discussants and people from SCI as well. So first, definitely must congratulate Ambassador Bhatia for producing a well-written and insightful book. As most scholars and researchers know, it's not an easy task to produce a book. So well done on seeing it through. So the first thing I'd like to say is that the book provides a comprehensive and coherent examination of India-Africa relations. I like how it acknowledges that Africa is not a monolith, but, and I quote, it says it's a vast and complex continent made up of 54 countries, passing through at any given point in time multiple transitions and not only a single one. And these transitions, as it's mentioned in the book, could be political, economic, social, and cultural. And I think a lot of scholars, especially outside of Africa, I think just because of convenience and just kind of making it easy, tend to just kind of view Africa and as a monolith. So I like that from the outset, the book acknowledges that the African continent is quite diverse and made up of many countries. Second, the ambassador aptly emphasizes that if development partners are serious about helping African countries and the continent as a whole achieve their development ambitions, that African voices need to be heard. Overseas development partners, institutions, and officials really need to take the time to consult with African leaders, scholars, experts, as well as people on the ground about what Africans really need. So again, this was a very good point that the book made. Third, the book aptly and concisely grounds India-Africa relations. It acknowledges the shared history of colonialism between the two regions, and how, by leveraging the shared commonality, Indian officials and leaders from Gandhi to Nehru sought to first cooperate and forge links with Africa politically and ideologically before building on this kind of ideological foundation and expanding to include peacekeeping, development assistance, and cultural cooperation. Fourth, for me, in a way, the book acknowledges that Africa is, I'd like to say, the last frontier for development, and how the rest of the world is or will become more dependent on the region for its markets, its investments, its goods and services. And overall, the continent, is expected or anticipated to become a significant driver for global economic growth in the future. So in this context, the Ambassador Bhatia really acknowledges that there's a need for Africa, for India, I'd rather say for India, to strengthen its economic relations with Africa. But he's also aware that this might be somewhat of a Herculean task for India, as other traditional Western economies such as the US and the European Union, and emerging economies such as Turkey, Brazil, and China also endeavor to do the same, to strengthen the economic ties with various African countries. And here is where I think the book could have been more impactful. I think that it could have potentially included a brief outline or plan of how India intends to strengthen economic ties with African countries, and more specifically motivate why India Inc., as he mentions, should increase its economic footprint in Africa, and how the Indian government can support Indian companies in this regard, as well as how African countries can also support or attract Indian companies to invest in their respective countries. Fifth, I was especially, having a grounding in China-Africa relations, I was especially interested to see how Ambassador Bhatia unpacked and outlined the China-Africa relationship. I like that he tried to be as rational and as Dr. Harshe mentions, and most of the book have quite a balanced overview. So the quote that really in this part of the book really echoes this balanced assessment is that he states that instead of demonizing China's Africa policy and its implementation, the competing nations need to focus on a more attractive policy models for themselves. And I like this point because, it's very easy to point the finger at China and look at what it's doing wrong. But other countries need to seriously think about what they bring to the table if they want to compete with China in Africa. We're already seeing kind of Russia and Turkey starting to do this to some extent. So now moving on to the questions that I have for the ambassador and the wider audience at large. The first being, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. I must admit, when it was first launched, I was pretty excited about it because at that time I was following the Belt and Road quite closely, and I thought, okay, here we could have some significant competition. But, we've seen it was kind of a flash in the pan kind of initiative. So I was wondering, can it be resurrected? And do you, in your opinion, think that it should be resurrected? And the second is to achieve the actualization of the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. We need a lot of investment in trade-related and industrial infrastructure. So far, India, or should I say, Indian companies have mostly, avoided investments in hard infrastructure on the continent. Do you think this will change? And what do African countries and governments need to do to attract Indian investment in the construction sector? And the third question that I have is regarding assisting African countries in their response to COVID-19. India has been very helpful with, medical and vaccine donations, and it teamed up quite nicely with South Africa in the COVAX initiative to make vaccines more accessible for developing countries. And given Indian expertise in the pharmaceutical sector, could we see India play a role in helping African countries develop vaccine production facilities like China is doing in Egypt, and is potentially in talks with South Africa to do so? There might be reports out there that it's already doing so, but I haven't come across. So if you could just kind of illuminate on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhagwandeen. I think some very relevant questions also. And perhaps let's before I hand over to you, Ambassador, to also respond to both Dr. Harsher and to Dr. Bhagwandeen, I'd like to sort of maybe add a couple of points for the panel to consider more broadly. And the first one is really picking up on where Mandira left off in the question about not the vaccines, I'll come to that, but in terms of African investment. You, Ambassador, serve, I think, on the advisory board also of the Confederation of Indian Industries. And so just to add to the point that Mandira made, what are the sectors that, she's mentioned construction, but what other sectors should Indian companies be looking at? Where is the competitive advantage? And a related question, what is Indian companies' perceptions of the continent? I mean, I know that the Indian government has lines of credit which are available to its companies to encourage them to invest in Africa. Sometimes these lines of credit are seen as are not always welcomed by African countries because there are conditionalities around, not policy conditionalities, but obviously most of it has to go to Indian companies. But what is the thinking in the Indian community? In the Indian business community? What are the sectors? And yeah, I think that covers it. I want to ask a second question, which is more sort of security and geopolitical, perhaps, and that's not about Ukraine. I'll come to that later, but. What I'd like to ask, and you touch on it in the book, relates to the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific has become sort of the latest sort of term. The Americans are using it. The Australians, I think, there is also very strong in the Indian debate. Clearly, the Indo-Pacific includes the Indian Ocean, includes the Western Indian Ocean. We are in Africa sort of beginning to have some of these conversations, but it's not front and center. We're also a little further away, perhaps, from some of the geopolitical contestations. But how do you see that evolving in terms of Africa? How should Africa be engaging with the Indo-Pacific as a concept? And I ask that again to all of you. I know there is also a question in the chat, but perhaps you can respond to those, and then I'll move to the chat, and then we'll go for a round of questions from the audience. Please also be happy to post them either in the Q&A or in the chat.
Thank you very much, panelists and Elizabeth. There's a lot of food for thought here, and I would not pretend to claim that I have all the answers, but I can certainly offer some inputs, and certainly later we must also ensure that we go to the audience and interact with them, and I know that as a very fair chair and moderator you will definitely do that. Let me express my warm thanks to Dr. Rajan Harshe. He received a copy of the book. I didn't know for all these days what he actually was thinking about it. So truly and sincerely, it's wonderful to see that a former Vice Chancellor, a former author of several books on Africa, has found it worth commenting in a positive vein. I'm grateful to him, but I will really like to comment on his critical points. I think it's very important for any review, for any appraisal, that criticism should be voiced forthrightly, and of the various points he has made, I think the one point is about the character of the author, that why are you so balanced? Why are you not taking sides, and why are you not adopting a more critical vein, because this can help the bureaucracies to reform themselves and the governments to take better notice of your work. Now this is where my two career paths coalesce. For 36 years I did serve as a diplomat, and for the past almost 12 years I'm only a former diplomat, and I'm very much I see myself as a scholar. But this has given me the advantage of both the worlds. I have seen how the system is from the inside, and now I'm an outsider. My purpose of writing the book was to motivate and encourage the policy makers to recognize that there are some problems, and that they should be and they can be fixed. So this was my justification in trying to adopt a balanced tone, and I'm happy to share with you that this seems to be working, because authorities are listening. They are trying to internalize the work, and I hope in some subtle and not so subtle ways, policy reform sooner or later will come. So I do plead guilty for being balanced. I do plead guilty for not being eccentric, but I don't think all scholars are eccentric. They contribute with their frankness. Sometimes we have to be blunt, as you use the word, that you can be blunt, and why hold back your knocks, but that is how I thought it can work better. But I think this is a book where if you read or reread some of the key passages, it would become clear the state of satisfaction or dissatisfaction on various aspects. I think this is what I really wanted to say. I'm also very thankful to Dr. Mandira for raising some very important issues. Thank you very much for your initial observations. With regard to your questions, briefly, I think I'm happy that this whole euphoria about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor has been neatly and decisively punctured in this book. Some of the advocates of this corridor almost created the impression that it is a reality, yes, whereas the fact is that it started off well and then the Japanese backed out. Yes. But nobody told the authors, the scholars. So they kept generating lots and lots of work on it, but I think somebody had to bring the bad news. But you are making a good point, whether it can be resurrected and whether it is required. My answer is yes. I think trilateral cooperation in any workable form is a welcome model. I think in this case, if India works with like-minded partner country and takes the beneficiary African country fully into confidence, then a trilateral project is a very good idea, for the simple reason that you need to marry different business styles and also marry finance, technology, and business platforms to do this. So we know that things are happening, but even with Japan, I think fundamentally our experts here in India feel that the engagement of business is of the biggest importance. On the African Continental FTA, a lot of interest is being exerted by the Indian business community. Confederation of Indian Industry, of which I am on the one of the advisory committees, has already mounted a very serious study of this FTA, where it is heading, and what are the implications for India. In the last 2 or 3 years, Ministry of Commerce here has been saying that it must have a bilateral FTA between India and Africa. So that is another thought which is being considered. But I think there is still not enough awareness about the African FTA, and not even clarity whether it has been fully operationalized. Probably not, because some of the component provisions are still being negotiated. But I think between the FTA Secretariat and Indian experts, there is a need for serious dialogue and some kind of a special arrangement, so India-Africa trade could be geared in that direction. My answer to your third point, Dr. Mandira, is about COVID, this concept of joint vaccination production in Africa. I think this is a good idea. Already a part of it is happening through the Quad or vaccine partnership. Three countries, US, Japan, and Australia have got together. They are helping a major vaccination production facility in India, and they are all set and committed to produce 1 billion or 1.2 billion vaccine doses and to deliver them to various parts of Indo-Pacific by the end of 2022, that is this year. And in our definition of Indo-Pacific, certainly Eastern Africa and Southern Africa are included. So in fact, this is the time, if some officials and policy makers are listening, from Africa, to get on to telephone with the Indian authorities and ask them as to what percentages and what shares and when allocations are being done for specific African countries. I think that is something that we need to develop. And that brings me, dear friends, to a very important question, very close to my heart, that Elizabeth has asked. And this is about the Indo-Pacific. Of the 4 Quad countries which really pushed the concept of Indo-Pacific, when they began to talk about Indo-Pacific, US and Australia and even Japan, their concept was that Indo-Pacific is Asia Pacific plus India. Asia Pacific, as you know, runs from Japan to Thailand. Asia Pacific did not include India. And so when the idea of Indo-Pacific came, they said, let us add India to Indo-Pacific, work together and see how we can deal with the China challenge. India did not fall for this from the beginning. India's position was clear that Indo-Pacific means the convergence of Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans. And Indian Ocean does have a situation where it washes the shores of Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. So India's conception has been consistent and very favorable towards Africa. Where is Africa in the Indo-Pacific debate? I agree with Elizabeth, it is missing. Should it be so? I don't think so. I think it is about time that both Indo-Pacific scholars and particularly African scholars began to invest more time, energy, resources to study where are the not just security and geopolitical dynamics but geo-economic dynamics in Indo-Pacific, and we have a lot of things to do. In fact, my own think tank, Gateway House, has been doing some very good work in this context, and I know in this week or in this month Indo-Pacific is a little less fashionable because of that word is starting with U, on which Elizabeth is going to raise some issues very rightly. But I would say that one of the takeaways from this discussion, if you agree, should be that Indian and South African and other African scholars must get together and start a dialogue on how to make the Indo-Pacific relevant to Africa and how to make African voices heard on this issue, because we are sitting here in Delhi convinced that Indo-Pacific has become not the only theater of the world but a major theater, and it's only a matter of time as soon as the Europeans begin to resolve their current problems, that the focus will be back on Indo-Pacific, because clearly the US-China contestation there has been sharpening consistently. I think I've hopefully covered at least the major points, and I'm very keen that I hand it over back to Elizabeth and to panelists so that we can also hear the audience as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. That's another idea for another roundtable, hopefully soon. I don't know if Mandira or Arjun, you want to add anything to those points before I move on to taking the question in the chat. Again, if
one point only I would like to add. One point only. I think Dr. Mandira's points were absolutely spot on. So there is, and also answers came to those. I thought, one area where India has always progressed during past 20 years has been information technology. And Africans have also requested always that they want to be not passengers, but drivers on information superhighway. So somewhere that, capacity building on information superhighway is one area where India has to cooperate. And Narayan Murthy, who kind of is an important giant in this area, has visited Africa in this context. Ambassador Bhatia has talked about Focus Africa program, Exim Bank, many other areas are there of business and trade. But digitalization of this part of the world is important, provided they also get electricity. And this is very major, I think, for them to kind of get properly integrated in the global economy. That's all.
Elizabeth, if I may, I just, thank you for touching on the Quad vaccine partnership with India. But I think my question is more of, can we see India partnering with African countries, instead of relying on a direct specific African country partnership in terms of, building facilities for vaccine development, similar to how Sinovac has been doing in parts of Africa?
Very quickly, in one sentence, the idea is good. There is no technical barrier on that. You remember that when HIV became a major challenge in Africa, particularly in South Africa, Indian companies played a seminal role in helping Africa to deal with that challenge. So, for the last few months, India was overwhelmed in terms of producing enough vaccines for its own people. It has been very successful. And as a result, now the numbers have come down. I hope they will stay that way. I think there is enough scope for discussions. I've been hearing some, but I'm not totally sure as to what is the present position. But the message can go out that between the pharma sector parties, there is a need for dialogue, and for India and South Africa in particular to work together on stepping up vaccine production facilities based in Africa.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat. It's from Christopher Diego. Thank you, Ambassador, for the presentation, which I found enlightening. I would like to ask if there's any major change in India-South Africa relations pre-COVID and now in this COVID, I don't know, can we say post-COVID phase, or am I tempting fate in putting it like that? And perhaps let me add a question to that, Ambassador, which is the India-Africa Forum Summit. What is the next phase for that? Where should it be going?
Thank you very much. I think I would be cautious as you are. I think we cannot pronounce the end of the COVID era. I think it is still a challenge in many parts, and if South Africa and India are in a somewhat better position, let us hope that they would stay there. I'm very grateful to the questioner because he was the first one who asked this question quite some time back. I think he deserves an answer. In terms of 2019 and now 2022, so India's Africa policy has not changed. It remains as robust and as partnership oriented as before. As far as India-South Africa relationship is concerned, I think this continues to grow warmer. Last major visit was by the incumbent president, Mr. Ramaphosa here, and that had gone off very well. My only worry really is that COVID has created certain shortcomings. First, as I said, for almost 2 years, India had to really invest resources in ensuring the health security of its own people. And then it also affected the economy, not merely of India, but most of the African partners as well. So that created yet another, impediment, so to say. But now you have also to take into account that there were other pressing, engagements for India. There was the big border impasse with China. The Chinese came in, they violated all the agreements. 60,000 troops are sitting along the border, and you can imagine that really becomes a serious diversion. And now, of course, you have Ukraine. But there is no policy change, and this is where I would like to link it to what Elizabeth is saying. There is a strong plea in the book that India should now try to recapture, together with Africa, the momentum of interaction that existed between 2015 and 2019. Those 4 years, Africa saw visits by more Indian president, vice president and prime minister than before or after. So we need to connect better. Also, India has to set aside more financial resources to cultivate the partnership. Obviously, therefore, the entire engagement of the polity has to be far more, because somehow I felt in the last 3 years that Africa was beginning to somewhat slip from our radar. Not just our radar, probably even the world's radar, if I may say. So this is the time when thought leaders, through a constructive alliance, can create a message, namely, as soon as COVID is truly over and gone, we should get on with the path that we have discovered for ourselves. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to continue to abuse my position as chair, and I want to pose a bilateral, trilateral question to the panel, and that relates to IBSA. So that's a South African question. It's not an African question, but it's a South African Indian question. Is there room for, I think over the last, we haven't had a summit, I think in 10 years now, or nearly 10 years. There's obviously been a lot of engagement at senior official level. I mean, I know in 2019, I participated in a small meeting. I think, Ambassador, you might have been there as well, the IBSA Academic Forum in Kochi. So there's been quite a bit of that, but nothing at a summit level. And of course, the summit level conveys sends a particular message. Is there space in the current geopolitical environment for an IBSA? Separate from the BRICS at a political level, because I think there's a lot of functional cooperation happening.
I'll be brief, and then panelists are welcome to chip in. This is a forum very close to my heart because it really developed when I had the honor to represent India in South Africa. Major conferences and interactions took place, and we worked very hard together with Brazilians and South Africans to take this forward. So one thing is that these international institutions, they don't die. They are created and then they somehow carry on, and then they pass through the phases of ups and downs. So this has been a down phase, but IPSA is down but not out. And it is not truly down in the sense that up to the ministerial level, they have kept enough life into it. The only question, as you rightly said, like IURA, the ministerial thing does not get elevated to the summit level. But I would say, objectively speaking, looking at what happened in the India-China relationship from 2020, and now looking at what is happening in Europe, this kind of polarization, I think there is very much scope for IPSA to rejuvenate itself, to reinforce itself, and there can be nothing better way to do this than a summit. In fact, it came very close in the last 2 years. Last time, I think they were trying to do on the sidelines of the G20. So we should urge the policy makers that it has its own uses. The common perspective of India, South Africa, and Brazil, the three democracies from three different continents with a very common view, a major voice of the South, and who knows, our efforts may actually succeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Dr. Harsha, Dr. Mandira.
One thing is that these are all emerging powers in world politics, Brazil, India, and South Africa. And somewhere when kind of United States and Russia, which is trying to become like former Soviet Union, or China-Russia combination, when such are the power configurations, I think emerging powers have a great role in terms of building a bridge between what is happening. And that is very, very important. So there is something like global balance and idea of peace. And balance of forces have to be tilted towards peace. And only emerging powers have that capacity to do it when major powers have take their kind of ideas and claims towards war itself. And that's a very strange part. So that's how I look at it.
I think you make an important point. And in my last question, I'm going to come back to that. Mandira?
Yeah, I agree a lot with what has already been said, and especially looking at cooperation between emerging powers. And I think given how, depends on how the Russia-Ukraine kind of conflict unfolds and the subsequent global economic impacts of that, I think now would be quite a apt time to kind of resurrect IPSA and also see how, given the anticipated economic impact, how can these three economies support each other, in terms of markets, in terms of business connections. It's quite an uncertain kind of economic time that we now facing with this conflict. So how can we buffer each other's economies in a more kind of putting it in that way? Yeah.
Great, thanks. I think that's a very important point that coming on the back of COVID and the economic difficulties that has created, we're now already, I think, experiencing really additional significant buffeting because of the sanctions, the oil price in particular, but also other commodities. And I know that India is also quite has a significant sort of trade relationship with China, with China too, but here with Russia. So I'm going to ask the question that I've been wanting to ask since the beginning, and bring that and then bring the session to a close. And it's really to actually understand a little bit, or to hear a little bit, particularly from our Indian colleagues, about the debate on what is happening in Ukraine in Ukraine at the moment. I know that apart from a large number of Indian students there that are really battling to get out, there are also broader sort of political issues. These are things that we are engaged in at the moment here in South Africa, and we're really keen to hear your analysis of where India, how India sees what has unfolded in Europe.
Very briefly, I would present to you the government perspective and also the other perspective. The government perspective has been clear, and it is that in a situation such as this, where you have obviously, the armed conflict which has begun by actions of a particular party, where twice Security Council has discussed and deliberated. Now the matter is going to UNGA. It is important for some countries at least to essentially project that war is not the option which can work. It has never worked, and therefore those 3 Ds that they are talking about, de-escalation, dialogue and diplomacy, that is the path to be resorted. Now this obviously troubles the West, because West is very clearly into the language of sanctions and condemnation and the rest of it. But the West needs to understand that every country has its own perspective and its own set of interests. India-Russia relationship goes back to a long time, and this impacts directly on India's concept of strategic autonomy. And therefore, at the end of the day, when there is a conflict between values, principles, interests, every country follows the policy of its interests. Safeguard your national interest. There's a whole lot of things which are well known about India-Russia relationship, and therefore Indian government has rightly withstood the pressure and taken the line that we are here to help in taking the conflict into a positive direction. Now, as far as the scholarly views concerned, there is a whole lot of hues, pro-government, some also anti-government, others taking a kind of a middle line. The point is very clear. Do we want to take sides and intensify the conflict further, or do we meaningfully and constructively help in the resolution of the conflict? At least some voices, some countries have to do that. In Europe, for example, Germany and France did that until the last minute, until Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Have they now given up, or are they still willing to try to contribute to a solution? That is the question that people are asking in Delhi. Certainly India, going by all the past major crises, whether it was Hungary, whether it was Korea, whether it was Suez, we are keen, I think, to contribute to peace rather than to war. That is where we are. But which way the camel will sit and how soon, common sense would prevail is something that remains to be seen. Sorry, I took 2 or 3 minutes more. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Dr. Harshid, do you want to add to that?
More or less, he said whatever I felt like saying. So no, nothing to add.
No, great. Thank you very much. Then, colleagues, I see there is Christopher wanted to ask one final question. I will give it to you, Christopher. We very quickly, just following up on your answer, there seems to be a continuity in India's policy with Africa, South Africa. Do you think that will remain the case? Because China seems to be reevaluating its policies in Africa, particularly regarding debt lending. Is there any particular reason why India's policies have remained the same?
When I said that they've remained the same, I meant to convey that Africa remains a priority for India, and according to the Prime Minister and other senior officials, India is keen to further take the partnership forward. And that is the reason why there is serious consideration as to, sorry, to come back to your own issue or the question, there is serious interest, I believe, in convening the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit. The only question is whether it can be physical or it will have to be hybrid. So on that positivity part, there is no doubt as to how much will be that positivity, how many more resources and how much more political commitment we can ensure, that remains to be seen. With regard to the specific question of debts, etc., I think there is full awareness in Delhi that several African countries are in serious situation, and they are asking for not merely rescheduling but actually debt waiver. And so some of that kind of issues have to be considered by our financial authorities. I do not know what is the present thinking, but it is linked to the question of the 4th summit. 4th summit will be held as the government prepares to allocate further resources. And so in a way, Elizabeth, I think we need to work together to create that momentum also for the 4th summit, because summit has its own momentum that is generated.
Yeah. No.
And one quick question to you in the end, if I may. What is the South Africa's perception on Ukraine issue?
The official government position, if we take it to the statement that was made at the UN General Assembly yesterday, is, I think, certainly very similar to India's. There was a statement that came out on Thursday, which again emphasized dialogue and the need for a negotiated settlement, but also actually called on Russian troops to withdraw. That created quite a fracas among those who comment on these things. I mean, that statement had certainly, by all accounts, emphasized the importance of negotiation and diplomacy, but actually also said that,
withdrawal,
going into another country probably isn't the best thing.
Yeah.
But I think South Africa's approach is very much similar. It's very much like India's. My only question is, do we as sort of BRICS members actually need to think about a strategy that can, a concrete strategy rather than just what we're calling for, but a concrete strategy that we can work on as other BRICS countries to lead to de-escalation, because I think that's the first step. Absent de-escalation, I think the rest becomes really, really difficult. To have a dialogue while there is escalation and for diplomacy to have a chance. So that's one of the things that I think is important for perhaps India and South Africa to be discussing. Is how do we bring about constructive dialogue and diplomacy, when it's very hot and there is, constant escalation.
Thank you very much.
Great. So on that note, all that remains is really to thank you very much, Ambassador, for giving us the opportunity to host the launch of your book. Also, a very big thank you to our two discussants, to Dr. Rajan Harshe and to Dr. Mandira Bhagwandeen. Thank you very much for contributing to a really interesting conversation. And thank you to the audience for listening and for participating. Please do look out for the book. I've posted it in the chat, and I hope that you've all filled in our evaluation form, which was also in the chat. That's from my organizers in the background. Thank you all, and I'm sure we'll see you soon on another similar platform. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And
Thank
see you
very
soon.
much. Thank you.
Bye.
Good luck to you and good day.
Bye-bye, Mandira.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Rajan. Thank you.
Thank you.